There are towns at the foot of Mount Rainier where the children already know what to do when the mountain comes for them. They've practiced it. Walk, don't run. Head for high ground. Don't wait for anyone. Because if that day ever arrives, they will have somewhere between 40 minutes and 1 hour before a wall of mud taller than their own houses pours across the valley floor. And there is only one road out. This is not a fear someone invented to scare you. 45 years ago, the people of Washington watched a mountain just to the south tear itself open. Mount St. Helens, May of 1980. It didn't bury anyone in lava. It didn't need to. The side of the mountain simply collapsed. The snow and ice on its slopes melted in minutes, and the mud that followed buried everything downstream. Mount Rainier is bigger. It carries far more ice, and the towns standing in its path today hold far more people than anyone wants to think about. So the question was never whether Rainier can do this. It already has, more than once. The only questions left are which towns it reaches first, and how little time the families living there will have to escape. By the end of this, you'll know the answer to both. And if you live in one of the towns we're about to name, you already know exactly which road I'm talking about. Let's start with the mountain itself, because to understand the danger, you first have to understand what Rainier actually is. It rises more than 14,000 feet over Washington state, close enough to Seattle and Tacoma that on a clear day, millions of people can see it standing on the horizon from their kitchen windows. To most of them, it's beautiful. A postcard. The symbol of the entire Pacific Northwest. But to the geologists at the United States Geological Survey, that same peak is something very different. They call it the most dangerous volcano in America. Not one of the most dangerous. The most. And once you understand why, you'll never look at that white summit the same way again. The reason has almost nothing to do with lava. Rainier is buried under roughly 26 glaciers and an enormous crown of snow and ice. More frozen water than any other mountain in the lower 48 states combined. Picture that for a moment. An entire mountain, wrapped in billions of tons of ice, sitting directly above valleys packed with homes, schools, highways, and farms. From a distance, that ice looks permanent. Peaceful, safe. It is none of those things. Because the danger of Rainier was never that it might erupt and pour out fire. The danger is that all of that ice could turn to water in a matter of minutes. And when it does, it doesn't flood the valleys below. It buries them. When most people picture a volcanic disaster, they imagine slow rivers of glowing lava creeping down a hillside, giving everyone time to back away. But lava is slow. In most cases, you can simply walk away from it. The thing that makes Rainier lethal has a different name, and it behaves nothing like lava. Geologists call it a lahar, and it is one of the most destructive forces on the entire planet. Here is how one forms. When heat rises through the mountain, from an eruption, or even from the slow, hidden warming of the rock inside it, all of that glacial ice can melt almost instantly. The water mixes with loose rock, volcanic ash, soil, and centuries of crumbled debris piled across the slopes. In seconds, what was solid ground becomes a liquid. Then gravity takes over. And what pours down the mountain is not a flood of clear water. It is a churning, grinding wall of wet concrete, in the largest events, more than 100 feet tall, racing down the river valleys at 50 miles an hour. It doesn't flow. It bulldozes. A lahar can carry boulders the size of delivery trucks as if they were pebbles. It snaps full-grown evergreen trees like matchsticks. It tears out steel bridges, swallows highways whole, and flattens entire neighborhoods, leaving behind a flat gray field of hardened mud where a town used to stand. When it finally stops, it sets like rock, entombing whatever it caught. And it can travel for tens of miles before it loses its energy, which means towns that feel comfortably far from the mountain are not nearly as far as they think. But here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. the part most people get wrong about Rainier. The mountain does not even need to erupt for this to happen. Let that sink in. A large enough section of the mountain's weakened, waterlogged rock can simply give way on its own, collapsing under its own weight, releasing all that trapped water, and sending a lahar racing toward the valleys with no eruption, no explosion, and almost no warning at all. And we know it can happen exactly that way, because the last time a lahar reached the towns below, that is precisely how it happened. We'll come back to that, because the proof is buried right under their feet. But first, imagine the morning it finally happens. It's an ordinary weekday in the valley. Commuters are filling travel mugs and scraping windshields. School buses are pulling up to the curb. The mountain stands in the distance, white and still, exactly the way it has looked every single day of these people's lives. And then, 14,000 feet up, the ground lets go. There is no fireball, no mushroom cloud. For the people in the towns below, the first sign might be nothing more than a strange, low rumble in the earth that doesn't quite feel like a passing truck. A few people look up. Most don't. By the time anyone understands what it is, the lahar is already moving. It enters the upper valley as a surge of gray water and tumbling rock, and within seconds it grows, gathering boulders, trees, and soil. Everything in its path, swelling into a flood of mud thick enough to carry a bridge away whole. It funnels into the river channels, and those channels point in only one direction. Phones begin to scream. Sirens begin to wail. And in homes and classrooms across the valley floor, thousands of families have just been handed the most important 40 minutes of their lives. The path that mud takes is no mystery at all. It has been mapped, studied, and quietly feared for decades. This is where the danger stops being abstract and starts having addresses. The river valleys that drain Mount Rainier act like channels. They funnel anything that comes off the mountain, water, rock, mud, directly towards some of the fastest growing communities in the state. The Puyallup, the Carbon, the Nisqually, the White. Each one a natural highway pointing from the summit straight into a populated valley. And one town sits closer to that path than anywhere else on Earth. Ording, Washington, is built on a flat stretch of valley floor at the exact point where two rivers off the mountain, the Puyallup and the Carbon, come together. It is, quite literally, in the bullseye. If a major lahar comes down those valleys, scientists estimate the people of Ording would have somewhere between 40 minutes and 1 hour before it arrives. That sounds survivable. It isn't. Because a wall of mud moving at highway speed gives no second chances, and there is essentially one main road out of Ording. Anyone who has driven that road knows how quickly it backs up on an ordinary afternoon. Now imagine every family in town trying to leave on it at the same moment, in the same 40 minutes, while the ground shakes. The road that's supposed to carry them to safety becomes the thing that traps them on the valley floor. And remember when this is most likely to catch people. Not in some convenient quiet hour, but in the middle of normal life. A weekday morning, with school buses already on their routes and the highways already full. The worst version of this disaster doesn't wait for a town to be awake, packed, and ready to leave. It arrives while the valley is already in motion, and it asks thousands of people to suddenly reverse direction and climb for their lives in the same few minutes, on the same handful of roads. And Ording is only the first domino. Follow the river down and you reach Sumner and Puyallup, bigger towns, tens of thousands of people, sitting squarely in the same path. Keep going, and the flow spreads out across the low, flat ground of the Puget Sound lowland, the valley floor where parts of Auburn, Kent, Tacoma, and Sumner stand today. Even communities that feel safely tucked back from the mountain, places like Buckley and Enumclaw, sit near valleys that have carried this exact kind of mud before. Add it all together, and scientists estimate that tens of thousands of people, by some counts well over 100,000, live, work, and send their children to school inside Mount Rainier's mapped Lahar hazard zones. Most of them have no idea that the flat, convenient ground their home is built on was delivered there by a disaster. So if you're watching this from Ording, from Sumner, from Auburn or Puyallup or Buckley, you already know which road I mean. And you already know how it feels to look up and see that mountain every single day. I genuinely want to know in the comments, do you have a plan? Or is this the kind of thing you've trained yourself never to think about? Because the ground you're standing on has done this before, and it remembers everything. And it isn't only homes that sit on that old mudflow plain today. In the centuries since, the flat, easy ground those ancient lahars left behind became the backbone of the entire region. Warehouses, factories, rail yards, and major highways, the arteries that move goods through the whole Pacific Northwest. Freight corridors, port facilities, the routes that connect Seattle to the rest of the state, much of it now sits on land that a lahar built, and that a lahar could one day reclaim. So a major flow wouldn't just threaten lives in a handful of towns. It would sever the highways, bury the rail lines, and choke one of the busiest economic corridors on the West Coast, not for days, but potentially for months or years. The cost would be measured in a generation, not a season. That is the true scale of what those 40 minutes of warning are really protecting. Here is the proof, and it's the part of this story that should stop you cold. Everything I've just described is not a theory or a worst-case fantasy. It has already happened more than once, and the evidence is the very land those towns are built on. To understand the future of these valleys, you have to look at two specific events in their past. The first happened around 5,600 years ago, and it was enormous. Geologists call it the Osceola Mudflow, and it remains one of the largest lahars in the mountain's entire history. It began when a huge section of Rainier's summit, weakened by heat and chemistry into soft, clay-rich rock, collapsed all at once. The resulting flow was so massive and so saturated with fine clay that it behaved almost like a liquid, sliding for incredible distances without slowing. It poured down the White River Valley and traveled all the way to the Puget Sound lowland, burying more than 200 square miles under mud and rock. More than 200 square miles. That is the exact flat ground where the suburbs of Kent, Auburn, and parts of Sumner and Tacoma sit today. Read that again, slowly. The land hundreds of thousands of people live on right now, the ground under their houses and schools and grocery stores, was created by a single catastrophe off this one mountain. And then it happened again, far, far more recently. Roughly 500 to 700 years ago, practically yesterday in geological terms, another lahar called the Electron Mudflow came roaring down the Puyallup Valley. This one flowed more than 30 miles. It reached the very spot where the town of Ording now stands and buried it under roughly 15 to 20 feet of mud. And here is the single most important detail in this entire story, the one that ties the past directly to the danger today. There was no eruption that day, no explosion, no column of ash on the wind. The mountain simply let a chunk of itself go. The flank failed, the water released, and the mud came, with no fireworks to warn anyone it was coming. So picture what that means for the people living in Ording right now. The last time a major lahar reached their town, there is no smoke on the horizon, no fire in the sky, no eruption on the news the night before, just a low rumble, and then a wall of mud appearing in the valley, moving faster than any person could run. The warning the modern world counts on, the dramatic, obvious eruption, may never come. Which raises the question every single person in those towns should be asking. If it gives almost no warning at all, how would you even know it had started? That is exactly the problem the region has spent decades and millions of dollars trying to solve. Today, the valleys below Mount Rainier are wired with one of the most advanced volcano warning systems in the country. Sensors sit along the rivers, listening day and night for the unique ground vibration that only a moving lahar creates. The instant one is triggered, the goal is to fire an alert that races ahead of the mud itself. Outdoor sirens, phone alerts, broadcast warnings. Anything to buy those few precious minutes between detection and impact. On paper, it's an engineering marvel. In practice, it has a terrifying limit. One resident who lived in Sumner for years pointed out the gap that keeps people awake. If you cannot hear a siren, if you're hard of hearing, or sound asleep, or simply too far from a speaker when it sounds. The very system designed to save your life may never reach you at all. A warning only works if it finds you in time. And there are other signs, the slower ones that may come before the sudden one. Scientists watch for swarms of tiny earthquakes deep inside the mountain. They measure subtle changes in the gases seeping from its slopes. They track the heat beneath the glaciers and the slow deformation of the rock. And there is a real reason scientists believe those signs might come. When Mount St. Helens woke up in the spring of 1980, it didn't explode out of nowhere. It gave roughly 2 months of warning first, a steady drumbeat of small earthquakes, and a visible bulge swelling on its north flank as molten rock pushed up inside it. Then, on the morning of May 18th, that bulge gave way. The entire north face collapsed in the largest landslide in recorded history. The mountain blasted sideways, and the snow and glaciers on its slopes flashed to water in an instant. The lahars that followed poured down the Toutle and Cowlitz rivers, ripping out bridges, burying homes, and choking the river channels with mud and shattered timber more than 50 miles from the summit. People who lived through it in Washington still describe that day vividly. And that was a smaller mountain, with a fraction of the ice Rainier carries. It is the closest thing we have to a preview of what's waiting. That is the hope for Rainier, that it stirs slowly enough and loudly enough to empty the valleys before it moves. But hope is not a plan. And a lahar born from a sudden, silent collapse of weakened rock may not offer 2 months of warning. It may offer 40 minutes, maybe less. The world has already seen, in living memory, exactly what happens when a town in a lahar's path runs out of time. In November of 1985, a relatively small eruption at a volcano in Colombia melted the ice at its summit and sent a lahar pouring down into the valleys below. In its path lay the sleeping town of Armero. There had been warnings that day. They were confusing, they were downplayed, and they were not acted on in time. That night, a wall of mud swallowed the town in the dark. Around 23,000 people died. It remains one of the deadliest volcanic disasters in modern history. And to the scientists who watch Mount Rainier, Armero is not a distant tragedy. It is the precise nightmare they are working every day to prevent. Because the towns sitting in Rainier's shadow are far larger than Armero ever was. Which brings us back to the children, and to the strangest, most haunting detail of this entire story. Knowing all of this, the people who live closest to Rainier do not pretend the mountain isn't there. They prepare for it. Several times a year in Ording, when the alarm sounds. The students do not duck under their desks the way kids elsewhere drill for fires or storms. They line up, they walk out of the building, and they move, on foot, calmly, as a group, toward the higher ground that rises beyond the valley floor. It's called a lahar drill, and for the children who grow up there, it is simply a normal part of going to school. Think about what that actually means. An entire generation is being raised to rehearse the act of outrunning a mountain, and the reasoning behind it is brutally, heartbreakingly simple. In a real event, the bridges out of town could be destroyed in the first few minutes, cutting off the roads entirely. So the community has spent years working toward a dedicated escape route, a path built specifically to let people flee on foot to high ground when the roads are gone. They are not planning to drive away. They are planning to run. And maybe you're asking the obvious question, the one a lot of people ask when they hear this. Why would anyone stay? Why build a life directly in the path of something like that? But the people who live there will tell you something that's hard to argue with. These valleys are some of the most beautiful and fertile land in the country. The soil itself, the rich farmland that drew people here in the first place, exists because of those ancient mudflows. Generations have built homes, raised families, and grown old in the shadow of that mountain. And the timeline of a volcano is almost impossible for a human mind to hold on to. 500 years between disasters feels like forever when your own life is measured in decades. So people stay. They look up at the postcard every morning, they send their kids to school with an evacuation route memorized, and they quietly make peace with the gamble. Because the mountain has always given them more than it has taken. For now, Mount Rainier sleeps. Every morning, the families in the valleys below it wake to one of the most beautiful views on Earth. And the overwhelming odds are that most of them will live their entire lives and never see that mountain do anything but stand there, silent and white against the sky. But the ground beneath them tells a different story. A story written in 200 square miles of buried mud, in rehearsed escapes, and children who already know the way to high ground by heart. The mountain has done this before. The forces that built the Osceola and the electron mudflows never went anywhere. And someday, years from now, or sooner than anyone expects, Rainier will move again. The only thing standing between those towns and that day is time, distance, and roughly 40 minutes of warning. So I'll leave you with the question that matters most, and I really do want your answer. If you lived in Ording, in Sumner, in the shadow of that mountain, and the siren went off on an ordinary morning while you were making coffee, would you run, or would you already be too late? Tell me in the comments. And if this opened your eyes to a danger you'd never even considered, take a second to subscribe, because we break down the hidden threats sitting quietly beneath the places people call home, long before they ever reach the headlines. The Earth is always moving.